Hello and welcome to this talk about doing UX research and ethnographic design for humanitarian technology. The projects that I reference in this talk are in the areas of peace building and crisis response. I'll be focusing in on how we specifically mitigated traumatizing and re-traumatizing people that participated in our UX research for these projects. There are some difficult topics covered in this talk, such as violence against women, Manchester Arena bombing, terrorism, natural disasters, colonialisation, racism, and educational social status prejudice. There may be other things that crop up as well that I haven't listed here. Do what you need to do to feel safe as we talk about these topics and explore. If that's leaving the talk, if that's getting up and moving around, if that's muting the audio, do what you need to feel safe and secure. Some slides will have no photos or copies, please. Please do not take photos of these slides, copy or redistribute in any way. Brief introduction to me. I'm Eriol. My pronouns are they, them. I've been doing design and UX for 10 years now. I've been in the humanitarian and third sector for around 7 years, some of that voluntary, some of that paid. And I've been in open source software for 3 years now. I'm also a PhD student researching humanitarian open source software and how designers get involved in and contribute to those kinds of softwares. I call myself a human rights centered designer. The content of this talk was from when I worked at Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a Kenyan-based NGO that makes open source humanitarian technology for human rights needs. Ushahidi was founded in 2007-2008 during election turmoil in Kenya. Ushahidi's tech tools are most commonly used for crisis response, citizen empowerment, election monitoring, and citizen-led reporting around human rights abuses. On the screen at the moment are 2 examples of Ushahidi's software. The first is when volunteers and citizens used the mapping platform to map the people that were most in need after the Nepal earthquakes, and helicopter aid was sent to them using that data from citizens. And the second is a crisis communication aggregation tool where when it's really tricky to get in contact with people during a crisis, this tool aggregates communication so that you know that people are safe. I'll briefly introduce the 2 projects and the aims of the projects that I'm going to talk about that we did this research for. The first was Izuku, and Izuku's aim is to explore the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya over the period of 3 years. You can find out more at izuku.eu. Izuku is spelled Isooko. The second is Dispatcher, and Dispatcher's aim was to discover whether technology can help people create and maintain resilience in times of crisis, and what kinds of technology aids rather than overwhelms. These were both differently grant-funded projects, but grant-funded nonetheless. And often grants stipulate in the proposal phase what is the scope of the technology and the design part of that technology project. This often doesn't allow for exploring the things that we learn through design research that might be unexpected or might be things that we didn't include in the proposal phase, and more critically, often doesn't allow for that project to pivot unless that is also allowed as part of the grant and made blatant and apparent in the proposal phase. Most humanitarian technology that is not profit-making is funded through these kinds of grants, which makes things really, really tricky, really restrictive and difficult. Unless there's further funding available to explore the things that you discover, or flexible structures, or maybe a partner organisation that can take on the new findings or different kinds of findings and pivot. I would often find myself noting key findings from research across multiple different projects continuously as I visited new locations where the context of either crisis or peace was incredibly relevant. For example, I did this kind of extra research for Izuku when I visited Kazakhstan, Tunisia and Romania for other projects, and I did the same for Dispatcher across the UK, Europe, India and Taiwan. For Izuku and Dispatcher, we focused on workshops for the public and civil society organisations. CSOs are an integral stakeholder of peace and crisis and the response to crisis, and therefore a key group to include in these kinds of workshops and these kinds of activities. However, from previous experience, a team member flagged that CSOs will have different needs and expectations than the general public. And we needed to offer them more value beyond the simple participation in workshops. We needed to offer them insight into how they do their own work with communities and their understanding of peace and crisis. Within this was a really big ask from the communities or the public in terms of what they want to share with us or what they could share with us, what we were asking for. This led us to consider what part trauma and revisiting trauma plays when participating in exploratory design research. As a person who has experience of trauma, I anticipated this when planning the research for both Izuku and Dispatcher. One of the public groups we worked with were Polycom Women, which are pictured on the screen at the moment. Polycom Women are a group of women across generations and backgrounds dedicated to peace building in Kibera, which is an informal settlement or a slum in central Nairobi in Kenya. Kibera has a lot of political, social and economical issues, to name but a few, and Polycom Women have a really broad and varied way of dealing and managing peace and peace-building activities in their local area, which they live and work. Working with Polycom and the other attendees at these workshops around peace was one of the first times I was confronted with not only my own personal experiences of trauma, but my personal experiences in relation to other people's trauma and how to manage that within a research context as the researcher, but how to remain empathetic as well, having that experience myself or similar experience. The public were asked to do journey map exercises of incidents or crises. Journey maps might be familiar to some of you out there. There's some resources that I can share afterwards if you're unfamiliar with journey maps. Some of the attendees talked about things such as, and journey mapped such things as being kidnapped, robbed, witnessing and being on the receiving end of gender-based violence, tribal violence or political violence. One of the Polycom women spoke in great detail about a peaceful protest activity that ended in injury as they had stones thrown at them by the rest of the community for being outspoken. On screen at the moment is an example of a journey map from a participant. It's separated into 3 sections: before the incident, during the incident, and after the incident. And when you look in more detail up close at the kinds of things that people were putting on these journey maps, you can see things like war and tribal conflict and high food prices, and then the sounds of bullets. And some of them were even more explicit than this example here. And I'm not sure about you, but I really struggled to truly understand these circumstances and how to respond as a researcher. But one of the ways we were able to work with this really well was the attention that we paid to trauma in our planning. So here is my own journey map that I used as an example in the workshop of my experience with the Manchester Arena bombing at the Ariana Grande concert in the UK. So this was used as a way to signal to the participants that we had gone through this process as well. We were doing our best to understand what it meant to ask this of people. So what I asked the people that listen to this talk to do is to, if they feel safe to, think of a deeply upsetting event in your life and begin to journey map that event. It's not a competition about who's got the most extreme circumstances or most upsetting event, but really it's an exercise to explore what it means to you as a researcher to interrogate and to create an artifact of an experience which was upsetting or even traumatic for you. And what I believe that this does, if you're able to do it, is I think it helps you begin to understand your own responses to traumatic subject matter and difficult subject matter, and the commodification of that into design artifacts sometimes. And it really does help when you consider doing these kinds of activities and workshops with participants. I just want to make sure that you know that we did this work as ethically as we possibly could. So the other things we put in place were that researchers went through the same process to build that understanding and empathy and to go through the process we were asking people to. They had those examples in the workshop to build that compassionate connection. Attendees were notified pre-workshop of the subject matter. There was psychological support on site and confidentiality, and the researchers themselves were also supported post-workshop. I want to leave you with an invitation to join a fantastic community that I'm part of, which is the Human Rights Centred Design Community, which you can find on the URL on screen, which is https://hrcd.pubpub.org. This is a really amazing community of people that work in human rights and technology and design, where we come together and we talk about the different kinds of topics involved in design and designing for human rights. If you want to find me other places on the internet, you can mostly find me on social media under Eriol Fox or Eriol Does Design, Eriol being spelled E-R-I-O-L. Thank you so much for listening, and see you in the Q&A.